Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page. And remember, if you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? I'm Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, where each week I speak with experts in the fields of technology, science, finance, and culture to help you gain the tools to better navigate an increasingly complex world so that you're less surprised by tomorrow and better able to predict what happens next. My guest this week is former United States Defense Secretary Ash Carter. Dr. Carter served as head of the U.S. Defense Department during President Barack Obama's second term in office, and before that served in the number 2 and number 3 positions at the Pentagon. As you can all imagine, it was a privilege to have a cabinet secretary on the podcast, particularly someone with Secretary Carter's breadth of experience and scope of responsibilities. His newly published memoir, Inside the Five-Sided Box, Lessons from a Lifetime of Leadership in the Pentagon, offers an insider's look at what it was like to head the largest department in the government with its millions of staff members and nearly $1 trillion budget. I began this conversation by asking Secretary Carter about his experience serving under Barack Obama, the unique challenges of dealing with Congress, and the exigencies of protecting the citizenry from threats, both at home and abroad, while also addressing some of the constitutional conflicts that arise from NSA surveillance and targeted assassinations of enemy combatants or terrorist suspects operating outside of traditional war zones and military theaters. It was also my intention to try to identify and do away with many of the assumptions that are embedded in much of the language and in many of the conversations around U.S. foreign policy, in order to see if we might be able to have a more honest and informed discussion about the nature of American power, what it means in practice, and how we might begin to think about international relations in a gig economy where people are increasingly working contractually on projects with team members located in just about every corner of the globe. Also, Dr. Carter has thought extensively about the future of warfare in the 21st century, including the role of autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare, topics that we discuss in this week's episode as well. And with that, let's get right into this week's conversation. Secretary Ash Carter, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Good to be here, Demetri. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure having you on. So I asked you briefly before you came in how I called it a press junket. We were debating about what a junket is. How has your press tour gone so far?
I think a junket is when you're not working and pretending you're working, and that isn't exactly the way it feels right now. No, I'm out trying to talk about the book, and it's a different kind of book, so you need to explain what it is. It's not a memoir. It's not about me. It's about the Pentagon, and I want people to understand that.
I actually said that it feels a lot like a dummy's guide to DOD.
It is kind of. I wouldn't say necessarily a dummy would stick with everything that's in there, but it is an outsider's guide. I think people are curious about. It's kind of a mysterious place to people on the outside, and even for people on the inside, most of them have seen a part of it. But it just turns out I've been there long enough and had all the different jobs. I saw all the parts of it.
Since 81? When did you go in?
81? Yes. Caspar Weinberger was the Secretary of Defense. Ronald Reagan was the president. So I've seen a lot of time and a lot of corners of the Defense Department and then, of course, it's the largest organization in the world. And so leaders and managers get a little sense of what I learned in all that time running the world's largest enterprise. And the last thing I'll say, Demetri, is about people might read it, I hope some young people read it and say, boy, this public service thing doesn't have to necessarily be military service or DoD service, but this public service thing really seems like a good thing to have as all or part of my life.
Do you think that people have been dissuaded from public service over the last 20, 25 years because of the political environment?
I think that one of the big distractions not been the political environment, it's been that the happening thing in society has seemed to be to go out and make money. Mm-hmm. And start a business, be part of the venture capital fuel. Yeah. And so for young people, the romance of being part of the government that was very present when I was a younger person went away for a little while. But, it's come back now, because what I'm doing now is I teach at MIT and Harvard. And the students there, they're different from the previous generation. First of all, they look around the world and they see that something's wrong in for example, in tech. I teach a lot of tech students, and obviously I'm a scientist myself, and they see that there's a lot of good that comes out of tech, but they don't have the naive view that everything turns out rosy, and they see the dark side and they want to do something about it. So it's a different generation. I actually find that really, really heartening.
We have the naive view. I have the naive. Well, I don't have the naive view anymore, but I think that's an interesting thing, right? Because in the 90s, the culture of the web was libertarian, anarchic.
Yes.
Right? And so much of that has changed now with really centralization on the software side, with companies like Google and Facebook.
Yeah, they have
the
become
data sort of chokes through these
institutions, and they can pretend at the top that by wearing a T-shirt or something that they're not just big corporations and so, but they have teams of lawyers and lobbyists and everything else. And obviously, we're now in the middle of a big transition of trying to bring corporate responsibility and public purpose more infused into the tech world. And I think it's time for that. It's a good thing. Overdue.
Your point about the thing you said about people aren't as familiar with the type of, you didn't say it like this, but the sort of leadership structure of working as a cabinet secretary. That's something I thought about when I read the book. McNamara, of course. Wasn't McNamara CEO of Ford?
Yes.
Before he came over to the DoD.
Secretary of Defense. Yeah.
Right. So I think one of the things I found most interesting about the book was trying to empathize with being the head of the Defense Department, or more generally being the head of a department, a significant department, where you have to have considerations that aren't, sure, the budget's enormous. You have more employees than all the big tech companies combined.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, I can do McDonald's, Target, Amazon, GE.
How many? What is 26,000? What is the number? No, what am I talking about?
No,
Sorry,
no. They're about 2.8 million.
Right. Because you have the armed
Plus,
forces also.
Well, yeah, the armed forces, civilians. Then you should add in contractors too, which is another 3 million.
Right.
That's 6 million. Then you add their children and their families, and that's a big chunk of America.
Yeah. So that's the obvious part. But what I thought was more interesting is to consider the political dimensions. Even the most extreme private sector case, which is Facebook, which is now embroiled in public debates, still doesn't have to take as many political cues or calculations into the thought process as, let's say, you would at DoD, right?
Yes. Well,
and you don't have to deal with the president on a daily or weekly basis.
Mark Zuckerberg doesn't even have to deal with his board.
Right.
And his board is a couple of handfuls of people, and no board would ever do what Congress did. Congress gives me, as Secretary of Defense, every year 3,500 pages of detailed regulations. I've been on boards and am on boards of corporations. We never dream of doing that to a CEO.
Also, your board doesn't hold public hearings.
Yeah.
I mean, like a corporate board doesn't hold public hearings.
And in fairness, under the Constitution, in the end of the day, it's their money.
Sure. But that's my point. My point is the fact that you have to testify before Congress, that you have to take in all these things into account. Another thing that, again, this is part of the starting light. At some point early on in the book, you describe the experience of sitting at McNamara's old desk. Well, it's the same desk, right? But in a new office? The office has been redesigned.
No, it's exactly the same place. I mean, that's the thing that's uncanny. And, of course, I've been in there since Weinberger's time.
Right.
Same desk, same table behind. The phones have gotten a little more digital, but they're same thing, lots of buttons.
That's what I wanted to ask
about. The president on one of the buttons, and pictures around the wall, the same furniture, the leather, the World War II stuff from the Pentagon's leather with brass tacks holding in, your butt sticks to them.
Huge desk. By the way, there's a picture of you in the, what is that, A24, not A24, what's
E4B,
the E4B, where
airplane.
those seats are enormous.
Yes, they're all like Captain Kirk, because in those days they were battle stations. Now there are people just open their laptop and do their secret or even top secret emailing and that kind of thing. But in those days it was all custom made, and they're big consoles.
So the funny thought I had when I was reading that part of the book was, I think, slightly neurotic, or this is where my neurotic tendencies sort of maybe go. And I thought, what if I accidentally called the president? I guess, so it's not just a phone that you pick up, it's you have to hit the button or whatever. But I just thought, what if I, the idea that you could just call the president, it's just something that, most people could ever imagine. Your role at the Defense Department, it's just very unique. So that kind of takes me to my next question, which is, what was that like? What was it like working you worked for Barack Obama for about 2 years, roughly, right? The last 2 years of the administration.
Although I was at lower levels, I was the number 2, and before that, the number 3 when he was president also. So
you were
in daily touch with him like I was as secretary. But.
So what was that like, having that level of access to power, that proximity to decision-making that impacts so many people, and also issues of life and death and security and things that, let's say, keep a lot of people up just sort of imagining them, that fuel so much of the dark fantasies of fictional television shows and shows like Black Mirror? I mean, you're actually living in that world. Yes, and I guess the first thing I'd say is it doesn't feel like fun. It feels like a very serious business. It's not a game. It's not some Washington game or anything. And then it depends also a little bit on the personality of the president. I was lucky in that I thought that the personalities of Ronald Reagan, both George Bush's, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, while completely different, were congenial and understandable to me. They were all very serious about their responsibilities. Clinton was warm and fuzzy and, give you a big hug, and he knew everybody by name in the administration. George Bush Sr. was on first-name terms with every leader everywhere around the world of every kind of conceivable generation. Barack Obama was a very demanding, sort of deadly serious guy about his responsibilities, and I really respected that. So they were all in their different way. That's interesting.
And Bush too, same thing. I mean, people make fun of him because they don't agree with the Iraq War or something like that, but he was a serious guy and a very decent moral guy. Bush 43. Yeah. So that's interesting. So Obama, the sort of playful qualities that we see in Obama when he gave Michael Jordan the Medal of Freedom, that's not the Barack Obama that you dealt with. No. That's very interesting. Yeah, no, it is. He changes modes depending upon the venue. It wasn't that he was cranky or tyrannical or anything like that, but he was serious and he was demanding. So I didn't go into him with a proposal for a combat operation, a strike, or a hostage rescue, or a escalation in either any of our campaigns or anything like that, without really doing my homework, because he'd ask questions and I wanted him to have confidence that I'd thought it through as well as he could think it through. So what was your position under Bob Gates during the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration? Well, I wasn't in the administration when he first came. Bob's been a friend of mine for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. Most of these people I've known for years and years and years. So Bob Gates and I used to go out to Aspen in the summer and hike and talk and so forth. So I knew him in between the time he was CI director and SecDef. When Bob came in, of course, and people asked him what were his priorities, he said Iraq, Iraq, and Iraq. I mean, he really focused very heavily on Iraq, and he didn't have the time then to branch out into all the things I talk about in the book about the rest of the world and acquisition. So when did he come into? When was he appointed by Bush? When did Rumsfeld be? 2006? I want to say 07, yeah. But then I became his top weapons buyer and technology officer when Obama became president. And Bob really had then Iraq kind of under control, if you can use that expression. And he had a lot more time for managerial things, which was useful to me because I was his top manager. And I could get his attention and get his agreement when I needed to do something that was big, like the tanker competition, Boeing versus Airbus, or straighten out the huge problems in the Joint Strike Fighter.
Yeah, you talked about that in the book.
Deal
Interesting.
getting MRAPs rushed to Afghanistan. I could always count on him to back me up. Meant a lot.
Mm-hmm. What was that transition like? You were there at the very beginning of Obama's administration,
Yeah.
right? Mm-hmm. What was that like? Because in many ways, you could see the evolution also of his foreign policy. I wonder if, is it fair to say that Libya, the adventure or misadventure in Libya, impacted his thinking about what to do in the second term? And how would you describe him? The shorthand for Obama's strategy, I've heard, is don't do stupid stuff.
Yeah.
But what is the Obama doctrine, and how did that evolve?
Well, I think it did evolve because people evolve in those jobs. They get more seasoned, they get more knowledgeable, they stop running against the guy who came before them and start.
Right, because he's reacting to
he's reacting to George Bush, and there was a lot of that in the early years. You know, he ran to end two wars. He ran on the ticket that Bush simplified things too much, so he wasn't going to be a simplifier. He wasn't going to follow the Washington playbook and that kind of thing.
Unconventional, you talk about in the book, that it was unconventional. That was sometimes frustrating for you. I found that very interesting, too.
Well, yeah, the conventional wisdom isn't always wrong. It's called wisdom for a reason.
You think he was by his nature, or he is by his nature, contrarian?
No. He
wasn't contrarian for the sake of being contrarian.
Yeah, I mean, you come off the campaign trail and you have this certain juice behind you, and all your supporters are like that. And so by the time I started to deal with him sort of regularly as the number two or the number one, he was past that point in the presidency when you're still running the campaign that got you elected, much more mature and reflective. I think where...
You're saying when you were defense secretary.
When you
became
right. Yeah, when he had been secretary.
I love that story you tell about when you really kind of pressed him on his proposal to have you as defense secretary, and then he said to you, that's like asking me if I still beat my wife.
Yeah, that was a great expression. He had some really wonderful expressions. And one thing that it was really nice to deal with him about was he was very respectful of people. And so if he had something to tell me that was unpleasant, he would wait until he caught me alone. And I really respected that's, of course, a rule I always have, which is you give praise in public and you give criticism in private. And if he was annoyed with something I did, he'd tell me privately, and I really respected that. And you know, sometimes I was gnashing my teeth because the evening would go on, we'd be sitting in the sit room, and he'd go methodically around the table and give everybody a chance to say what they had to say. And at some point, I'm like, my stomach's growling. It's dinner time. I mean, come on, we've heard from everybody, all the people that, in my judgment, were the principal ones who needed to act on that particular decision. Do we really have to ask everybody?
I think everyone can relate to that situation. The conference calls or those long, endless meetings.
Narn over until everybody's spoken.
You give an example in the book of being reprimanded by the president in private and what that experience was like. What was that like? I mean, that's quite an experience. We all have the experience of being reprimanded by our bosses.
Yes.
But here your boss is president of the United States.
It didn't bother me because he did it in such a straight way, and he did it privately. And I knew that I had exceeded my authority, and I chanced it. You know, the old expression, better to seek forgiveness than permission.
Yeah.
I was in a hurry. I thought it was the right thing to do. I knew it wasn't a decision to make by myself, and I got caught speeding.
So this thing about the foreign policy and the strategic view of the Obama administration is interesting in the context of the larger evolution of American foreign policy since the end of World War II. I mean, it seems that with the Cold War, the focus was obviously very traditional, and there was a bipolar world. And then with the war on terror, it shifted, right, to trying to, I mean, in fact, I think Rumsfeld even came into office before 9/11 talking about reorganizing the armed forces and making them more agile,
his
right?
His first quadrennial defense review, which was, I think, going to be published on September 10th, just one day before, wasn't about terrorism at all.
Well, he was also looking for like $4 trillion that were missing, or $3.6 trillion missing in the budget.
I don't remember that. Remember, he was Secretary of Defense twice, and I think...
Right, under Nixon.
Yeah, and if you go back that far, I think maybe he had some memories of how the department worked that weren't exactly the way they still worked, and he was still updating himself.
So we had this transition where the Petraeus was very influential, I think, also in that.
In the counterinsurgency.
Right, counterinsurgency training and everything else. And now we're moving back again towards a world where, now it's a multipolar world, so it's different. It's also very high-tech, but there are also nation-state actors.
Yep.
It's not the Cold War, but it's also not that war on terror.
Bingo, you're so right. You're so right. Well, and remember, there was a little interregnum of the 90s when we didn't have anybody to worry about. And, remember all the business about peacekeeping and so forth? And that seemed like a luxury. And Russia was down and China was down. You didn't have to worry about them. Then the era of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. And yes, and this was important to me, was to make this strategic transition from the era of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism to get back to full spectrum, and particularly Russia to China. And that's still going on. It needs to go on. I hope it goes on.
All right, so this is where I want to kind of start to dig in. Help me understand, what is the working assumption of people in the Pentagon and the government about what the world... So there's like the Hobbesian view of the state of nature, right? Which is a war of all against all, or man against man, whatever it is. What is the underlying assumption of the foreign policy establishment of what would happen if the United States pulled back, or sort of what the state of rest would be of the world? I mean, what's the starting point from which ideas of foreign policy are created? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And it's been debated in the course of our history whether being involved or withdrawing is the right thing to do. Now, that was a more arguable point years ago when the oceans protected you and you could kind of withdraw. But even then, the United States found itself drawn by its own interests. It's not that you're drawn in because you're suckered in by foreigners or that you're trying to do them good at your own expense. It's because your interests reside there. And there are two things that are important to me. I mean, one is to recognize that these guys are really intent upon, if not doing us harm, at competing with us and trying to minimize our own influence and economic opportunities, sometimes in the case of China. We got to protect ourselves against that. And the other thing is that I'm old-fashioned, maybe, Demetri, but I actually believe in the values that we stand for. And China is a communist dictatorship. That's fine. I'm not out to change them and make them not communist, like we were out with the Soviet Union. Okay.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
But I don't want to be Chinese either. I don't want to be a communist. I don't want to live in a dictatorship either. And I think their ideology really is about being Chinese. And ours is, at its best, about the rights of man, as the Enlightenment would have said. And so you need to stick up for your own values, and you need to stick up for those who share your values around the world. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in a world where the things that you care about aren't present. So for both those reasons, you can't walk away. Now, I am for hard bargaining when it comes to, people used to say to me, for example, Demetri, what are you going to do about the Middle East? What's your strategy for cleaning up the Middle East? And I would say that cleaning up the Middle East is not an objective of mine. That's not an American interest.
What does that mean?
Making
does that
everything
mean nation building?
Yeah, they mean
Right.
all this turmoil in the Middle East, everybody not getting along with one another, old sectarian rivalries and so forth. What are you going to do about all that? And my standard answer to that is, my approach to the Middle East is based upon our interests. In that sense, we're selfish, Demetri, but selfish and withdrawn are two different things.
Well, what do you think about the contribution of American foreign policy in the Middle East? And of course, that goes way back. It goes back, I guess, at least since the Suez Canal, officially maybe. Mm-hmm. But what do you think in particular with the Bush administration and the war in Iraq and since that period?
Well, the war in Iraq really didn't turn out that well. I can't tell you I was clairvoyant in that regard. I did not oppose the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
You supported
I believed the weapon of mass destruction arguments. I'm not going to say I was wiser than anybody else, but it's plain as day. There weren't weapons of mass destruction, and the whole thing turned into a pretty messy situation because we conquered the place, and then it didn't rule itself. It descended into chaos.
Mm-hmm. At that time, what was the thinking, the sort of deeper thinking about why Saddam Hussein could not stay in power long term? What was the idea behind that?
I never got that part of it. I know that my predecessor, Dick Cheney, felt very strongly about that. I think he had since the end of the first Gulf War, and he believed that it would have been better if we had taken out Saddam Hussein at that time.
You think it was going to be a problem at some point?
Yes, I think that's right, that he was a ticking time bomb. And if he didn't have WMD now, I don't want to put words in Dick's mouth, but maybe even if he didn't have him now, although Dick says he believed he did, he would at some point. And so we ought to finish this off. I think there was a lot of thinking on his part.
So kind of like North Korea, that it would evolve into a North Korea?
Maybe that analogy. North Korea is so sui generis, it's hard to say. But anyway, it was always the twin of North Korea. You know, we used to have this strategy of two major regional contingencies after the end of the Cold War was our official military strategy, which is really a way of bolstering force structure.
The idea of fighting two wars simultaneously, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. And that was Colin Powell and Dick Cheney's response to the bottom of the budget falling out at the end of the Cold War. And people said, we don't have the Soviet Union anymore. Why do we need a defense budget? And they needed an answer that was a pretty big answer. And so you take two enemies and then you say at the same time, and that you can use that to argue for a substantial force structure. And they weren't trying to cheat anybody, but they were worried about the bottom dropping out of the defense budget and us dismantling the U.S. military.
Well, that was the period where this concept of full spectrum dominance came into vogue, right? This idea that this was an opportunity to solidify American, you could call it American hegemony over the world, right? And this brings us back to another question, which is it possible to have a world without either a global hegemon, or is there always going to be competition in a sort of a national type competition? Because I also was thinking about this idea of this post-Westphalian order that we've been living in for the past 400 years, or less, actually, slightly less. Again, is that even a natural state? It feels like some of the assumptions that we've been living with for so long, we need to revisit them. But it's not clear what that means in practical terms.
And yes, or in the way you initially framed them, no and no. I'm going to disagree with you about whether the United States acted as a hegemon. There's a difference between a hegemon and a leader, and I'll come back to that. And that's more than just a self-primping American idea. And the other thing is there's a difference between the overweening suzerainty of one country and international system based on principle in which, most of the people most of the time get to do pretty well. And I think we've stood more for leadership than hegemony.
Right. Well, it's not,
I really believe that about the United States. I mean, sure, at the end of World War II, who could stand up to us? We were half the world's GDP. I mean, it was unbelievable. But we didn't use that only in an overweening way, the way some other countries and other cultures might have done at that moment of history, certainly as Germany would have done and Japan would have done had they won the war rather than we won the war. And I think there is something to an international system which is not just states, which is the Westphalian thing, but states plus rules, and rules that are not just about state A doesn't attack state B, but state A respects to some extent the internal affairs of state B, and that we have some general rules about how trade occurs, how politics occurs, and what is okay security-wise in terms of violating one another's sea space or airspace and so forth. And you need to have that if you're going to have a world where everybody isn't on tenterhooks all the time and war isn't breaking out all the time.
So this is interesting. I didn't actually think of this before we started the conversation, but it came to me now. Before the United States, it was really Great Britain was the first global power, could you say? I mean, they had certainly global naval power.
Yes, by dint of their navy, yes,
right.
I would say.
But that was still a world where the number of corporations that we have in the world today didn't exist under the British Empire, right?
That's right.
So with the United States global order that came out of the end of World War II, it was more enlightened insofar it was more evolved, and it was more consistent with the world that existed at that time. And the idea of interests, this idea of American interests, also had to do with protecting seaways and creating a world that was safer for commerce, right?
Yes.
For commercial interests, for corporations. So it seems now that there's a further evolution somehow happening. I mean, in a sense, we see it in the U.S. We kind of touched on it before, this idea that a lot of people are more entrepreneurial today. There's this empowerment of the individual.
Yeah.
right? The individual is more empowered today than at any previous point in our entire history. Our Constitution was created in the late 18th century for a world with no running water, no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no powered locomotion. People were largely agrarian societies. There was large amounts of infant mortality, everything else. And the primary concern about abuse of power came from a central state, right? The government. And the Constitution was written to prevent the accumulation of power and to protect the sovereignty of the individual. Now we live in a world where a sovereign individual has the capability today, with very limited technical capability, to, as we've talked about in our episode with Bruce Schneier, but also with Josh Corman, both on cyber terrorism and security and warfare, to scramble blood records the day before a surgery or the morning of a surgery, very easily kill lots of people. That's a very simple, dumb attack. But there are more sophisticated attacks that can still be done by an individual or a small collective of individuals. Fast forward however many years, we could get to a place where an individual could print a bubonic plague and spread that. So we're talking about a world where an individual can commit massive atrocities against society as a whole. It used to be the government was the concern. Today, the individual is also a concern.
Yes.
And I feel that this dilemma has presented an increasing problem in the public mind. Because on the one hand, we want and expect to have privacy and individual sovereignty and our rights in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And at the same time, we can feel this instability in the world.
Yeah.
We can feel
and the
it.
need for collective protection. Yeah.
How do we navigate that world in all? And I don't know that there is a clear answer. And this is sort of, again, part of the problem. And let me just say this and set it out. I think that by and large, most of us have made a deal with ourselves, which is we say we want this, but at the same time, we kind of want to look away while you do all of those things that you need to do to keep us safe, right?
Yeah.
And that hypocrisy, that line, has become increasingly difficult to walk.
Yeah. Yeah, everything you say makes perfect sense. To the last point I used to say in troop talks, I said, sometimes you feel like your fellow countrymen don't understand what you do and don't appreciate it. And I said, that makes me angry too. And sometimes I feel the same thing. But here's how you console yourself. Remember that if we do our job well, they won't even think about us. They'll take us for granted. That's the great paradox of providing security to people. But you can't allow them to take too much for granted. I think there is a change in the mood of people now, and you see this affecting tech. It's something we were talking about earlier, where they are aware that technology isn't all good. It puts evil things and darkness in the hands of small individuals. You see that in social media. You see it big time, potentially in the kind of super terrorism that you're talking about. Now, how
also,
do we
again, in corporations too, like that's something we discussed with Shoshana Zuboff. Google, Facebook have tremendous amounts of power.
Yeah, and people are getting tired of that as well and saying, that needs to be checked in the interest of overall public good. To the terrorist thing, I mean, you're right. All those things are formidable, and more power passes into the hands of smaller and smaller groups of individuals. That's a scary thing. On the other hand, more and more power comes to us collectively if we use it well to protect ourselves, to do counterterrorism. And so there is another side to it as well. But we need to believe in our institutions that do that and not think that if they're trying to do some reasonable level of surveillance, that they're violating our freedom all the time, and that balance needs to be done in a more open way. And as far as companies are concerned, every once in a while I have a business person, and I hear this particularly from a lot of VC type people, and they describe themselves as self-made. And I have a little riff I do with them, Demetri, and I say, how'd you get here tonight? We're having dinner together. How'd you get here? Well, I took roads. I said, well, where'd the road come from? And your company's very successful, and I respect that. You have employees, right? Yeah, I have employees. I said, well, can they read and write? We had that occur. This idea that you're self-made is, none of us is self-made. You're talking about an era when people realized that to get collective water, they had to support the government to have a water company and so forth. I think people are taken for granted what government is. And it's not that I'm trying to stick up for government, that I'm trying to say that government isn't a thing that stands apart from us. Government is how we do things that we have to do together in order to have a decent life. And it can be just protecting ourselves, or it can be doing the roads and so forth. And people need to stick up for those things, and companies need to feel some loyalty to where they live. This is one of the problems that I've had occasionally with companies that have acted like they're not American.
I also think, though, that not what you just said about companies not being American, but the thing you were saying earlier, it's a lazy way to think about the world. In other words, there's so much more nuance in the world, and the idea that there's just the government and then there's just the private sector is ridiculous.
Yes.
And in fact, there is a huge amount of cooperation between the government and the private sector. Again, this brings us back to issues that are concerning. The Chinese, that line is not even necessarily there.
Yes,
it's certainly very different. I've struggled. We've done a number of episodes on China. We did one on Huawei as well a few months ago. It's still difficult for me to understand China. I do my best. By the way, interesting anecdote you mentioned in the book. You said you never actually met with Xi Jinping, right? Because you were,
I did. No, I met with him when he came to the
him.
United States. I didn't travel to China as he asked me to, for the reason that he had embarrassed Bob Gates, my predecessor, when Bob visited. And that ticked me off. And I thought, well, you're not going to do that to me.
Yeah. Also, I remember, it's not from your book, but I remember George Bush W. talking about going to Russia, and Putin showed him his dog, and he said, bigger, faster, stronger, because he had the terrier.
Uh-huh.
I forget, what's his name? Barney. He had Barney the terrier.
I remember he brought his dog in. He knew Angela Merkel was terrified of dogs, and he brought his dog in to meet with Angela Merkel. He used his dog a lot.
Fascinating.
Very Putin-esque.
Yeah, we're all at core, we're hominids. But this brings us back to the fact that the world changes. We don't live in 1776 or 1787 or 1801. We live in a very different world. And we have to grapple with these changes. And the relation between the government and the corporate sector is also fuzzy, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, one of the things we talked about, like I mentioned, Shoshana Zuboff's episode on surveillance capitalism, one of the themes that she explores there is this concept of what she calls instrumentarianism. She has this notion of surveillance capitalism.
Yeah,
you're familiar with this.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So
concept.
It is the modern-day version of totalitarianism. Yeah. It is what happens...
It's corporate totalitarianism.
Corporate,
it's an odd thing.
I think it's a combination of government. It's the corporate sector just working ever more closely with the government and using the tools of the private sector that are currently being driven by an ad model to begin to shape political ends. And it's a very disturbing view of the future. And it's informed by the realities of the power of behavioral algorithms and just how pervasive our technology is. Does that concern you?
It does. It does. But I am more concerned about abuse on the part of companies than I am abuse on the part of the government. And I'll tell you why. And this may surprise many people to say, but I think that tech companies have a demonstrated history. If Facebook has a demonstrated history of using your information in a way that people have concluded is detrimental to their best interest. It was good for the advertisers. It was good for Facebook. It wasn't so good for them, including Cambridge Analytica. Mm-hmm. I know this is unpopular to say. Nobody wants to stick up for NSA and so forth. But I have had a top secret communications intelligence clearance since 1980. And in all those years, Demetri, and this is just an honest statement, never was I aware of, and I haven't read about in newspapers or history books, an instance where the United States government used its signals intelligence collecting capabilities against an American citizen, either to disgrace them, extort from them, imprison them. I just don't know of any cases. It was pretty deeply ingrained in us that, and I know it wasn't NSA employees, that it was foreign surveillance only. Now, that wasn't that things weren't collected that didn't have Americans on them. We always had the problem of two people calling each other.
Like mass surveillance you're talking about.
Yeah, we always had problems of people making international calls, and one of them would end up being American.
Right, but I mean, with metadata, it's
much more complicated. Yeah,
right.
So there's all this stuff collected.
It's more invasive. It's more invasive to the individuals.
Yeah, but that's not more invasive than companies.
You're saying that the NSA surveillance is less invasive than
well, I don't know,
corporate.
less, but it's sort of on the equal to Google or
Its
Facebook.
motivations
in
are different.
Terms of,
It's
yes,
the
its
logic
motivations
of
are
its algorithms is different.
Foreign intelligence. They're not trying to make money off of you, and I'm just reporting a fact, which is I'm unaware of any examples. I know people are very uncomfortable with the government doing that, and they should be, but I don't think they can deduce facts of what they fear. That's a remarkable thing. And if there were counterexamples, I'd freely give them. I think it's a remarkable fact of all the decades I've been associated with it. I've never seen it misused. I think that's a pretty good track record.
Do you worry about its future misuse? I think
Sure.
that's the problem that everyone has, right? The idea is if tools exist, what really, again, it brings us back to the point of the logic of the system. What is the logic driving the algorithm, or what is the logic driving the application of the tools or the systems? That's the concern. What happens as our government evolves, as we get new leaders? One of the things that some of us already were aware of this. You were obviously more aware of it than others, but we've known for a long time that the executive, ever since the end of World War II, the executive has been increasingly cloaked with greater and greater amounts of power, right? After Nixon, that took a hit. But after 9/11, that was, you mentioned, one of Dick Cheney's big gripes was that
Restore the power of the presidency.
Restore the power to the presidency
Fair,
and the
yes,
executive.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That has made a lot of people feel uncomfortable in the current circumstances.
I understand.
Is that not a point of concern?
Yeah, of course it will be. People if they don't like the current president, they're not going to like the idea of strengthening the presidency in this.
But what about beyond not
this-
liking the
this
president?
era.
And what about being concerned about the motivations of the president or the sort of disposition?
Well, that's what I mean by not like.
Right.
I mean, I'm being nice.
Right.
That not thinking he's a good president, not trusting him, feeling that he will misuse the power, whatever the source of it is. I don't think it's right to hobble the government to make us safe from the worst possible president we can imagine. Because when you do that, you do trade away something, which is the ability of the government to act collectively, to protect our people, to advance our commerce and so forth. There has to be a modicum of trust. If that trust goes away, then we'll be back to where we were with King George of Great Britain. I hope we don't get back there.
See, this makes me think about something else, which is the importance of having an informed citizenry. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's not even an informed citizenry. There's sort of a collective, it feels like a bit of a psychosis that's happened in the body politic. And it has, I think, a lot to do with the not just lack of trust that maybe stems from the natural cycles of, let's say, missteps or abuses of power, but also I think it's the technology. It's the logic that animates the technology. It's the fact that people are being increasingly siloed. News organizations, media outlets are increasingly radicalizing, I feel like, the population. The algorithms are driving increasing levels of radicalization in the public. And so we have a democracy, and yet we need to have a public that can sort of be brought along. Public opinion actually has to mean something other than just being herded.
Yep.
And public opinion was mobilized by the Washington Post, not mobilized in a
Yes.
sort of centralized sense, but they were mobilized.
And Walter Cronkite.
Exactly. Walter Cronkite had the respect of both the left and the right, right? That was,
Yeah, we had a public version of a common truth.
We don't
and then
have
we
that.
could disagree after that. No, and I'm a scientist. So when I started out in science, scientists were, in my father's generation.
Now, you had a PhD in physics, right?
Yes. And we didn't quite dress like this in my day, but in my father's generation, they had the skinny black ties and the white shirts, and everybody thought that they spoke the pure truth.
Right.
Now, we know
Yeah.
since then science can have certain aspects of opinion and so forth, but at some point you got to trust. Now, when I don't know something, I start reading. And that doesn't mean I'm totally credulous that I believe everything I read, but I read people whom I have reason to believe know more about that subject than I do. And I trust what they say because I think they're telling their knowledge straight. We used to have a collective understanding of where you went to get that kind of understanding, what was going on today and what the truth was. When you lose that, you become really unmoored as a society. And that's what worries me about the sort of attack on truth, attack on the press. Well, fair enough. But at some point, even attack on science in certain places, vaccinations, that kind of thing.
Again, and that the vaccination issues and some of these flat Earth ideas. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Are you? It'd be funny if you weren't.
I've heard of them, but people
it's hard to believe
things that are kind of
hard
outlandish.
to believe.
Yes,
but it's people. There are people that are making a lot of money and very successful that believe that. You know, professional basketball players and musicians that believe that. It's hard to believe, and I think it only becomes possible to process when you begin to view this from a lens of some kind of. Again, I don't know if psychosis is the right word, but it brings us back to this point that objectively speaking, philosophically, we can have a conversation that we can debate the objectivity of truth, right? From a philosophical standpoint, there may not be any objective truth. It may all be subjective. But there was what you described, a sort of collective, subjectively agreed upon hallucination of the truth, right? We had a generally agreed upon view of what the world was. That is increasingly being broken apart. And and I do find it to be scary in the context of what we're talking about here.
You know, it's based upon, if you doubt that since Copernicus people have been lying to themselves, that's a pretty wild hypothesis. How could so many people have been so wrong for so? It's one thing if you hear of a new theory and you say, well, I don't buy it. I'm going to wait a few years and see what this is.
You're talking about geocentric
You're talking about
views?
Flat Earth.
Oh, yeah. Well, that goes even before Copernicus.
There
even
has
before
to
that.
go with that is another belief, which is that in the intervening years, since that was demonstrated not to be the case, that millions and millions and billions of people have been deluded. I find that kind of...
it's horrifying, to be honest with you.
How do you think so many people are so stupid for so long?
But it also just says something about, I think it assaults our notions of the dependability of a general mind, the general sort of mind, because I can't imagine that all those people are crazy, right? There's got to be something else going on. You know, there's something in the water, as they say.
Well, but they think a lot of other people are crazy. That's the thing that's interesting to me, and have been crazy for centuries. So, a lot of craziness to believe in.
One of the other things that we've talked about on prior episodes has to do with cyber warfare, and I mentioned to you before about the Schlieffen Plan was an example I brought up to Bruce Schneier, because when we were talking about cyber warfare, and then he made a great point, which I hadn't thought of, I was basically saying, okay, in World War I, the Germans, for example, or the continental powers, they were incentivized to mobilize first. There was a hair trigger. They were on hair trigger alert because mobilization during the First World War could be the difference between success and failure. During the Cold War, as you've pointed out in the book, we developed the nuclear triad, and it doesn't even matter if there's a nuclear first strike against the United States, because of mutual assured destruction, can still retaliate.
Right. That was a reaction to the dynamic of World War I, essentially.
Right, exactly. And so now we're in a world where not only are we incentivized to act first, we're incentivized to act fast, because an exploit can be patched. A vulnerability, it can be patched. And also the vulnerability, the other thing is that's concerning is that if the NSA, for example, or the U.S. intelligence community has identified an exploit in some software that a foreign entity is running, that software is also software that we're using. Yep. And so the lines get fuzzy between who the enemy is, I don't know what the opposite of the enemy is, but where the lines are. Again, this brings us back to the fact that the world is not what it was 50 years ago. The individual has been more empowered. There's all this globalization. People are working across the world and commerce and everything else. I guess for me, when I think about this, it feels chaotic.
So
the world feels chaotic in a way that it didn't feel before.
Let's take the two things you got going on there. One was the gray zone between war and peace and the fuzziness, and the other is pace, how fast things unfold. Let's start with the pace thing. That, to me, is the most fundamental, and where most people, I think, fail in thinking about cyber war. It is in the category of what we used to call, in the Defense Department, I think they probably still do, hybrid warfare. That is that zone between war and peace, conventional war and conventional peace, that is increasingly populated by new things like cyber, but also by little green men and lying to the press and so forth, where you're basically carrying out an aggression like the Russians in Ukraine, and you're trying to put up enough smoke and enough fuzziness that people aren't quite sure whether they're at war or not. And I'm not fooled by that. People always just say, if there's a cyber attack, is that an attack? I said, yes. I don't care. Scheiber, Schneiber. If it's an attack, it's an attack, and I'll know if it's an attack. So we have to take that gray area, and you need to dominate that intellectually, as certainly as a military leader, and be sure that you can say what side of the line
the problem
you're
of
on.
attribution also.
Well, yeah. And to that, in attribution in cyber, it's not as hard as, I mean, we knew basically the Sony hack was done by the North Koreans. We knew basically the Russians were.
But you may not be able to prove it without revealing sensitive.
I think there's a
sources
bigger
and
thing
method.
going. I think the country has a greater hesitancy to act because they don't want to seem precipitous or to prejudge the issue. I don't think that's safe. I think that we ought to, in the case of cyber, you're going to at some point have to say, if you have established yourself, a reputation for yourself as the kind of country that does this kind of thing, and we get attacked and it kind of looks like you're going to get what kind of looks like a response from us. And you have to scare people away from getting in the gray zone because you're going to treat them as in the black zone. You simply have to do some of that.
So this kind of highlights two issues. One, I brought up, I tried to express it when I talked about the fuzziness. It feels to me, speaking personally, it feels like the world is becoming one where the individual is increasingly walking through a hazy environment where there are bullets whizzing by. It feels like there's a lot of crossfire. Even the way we talk about cyber war. What does it mean to get attacked? And also, we have professional armed forces. We don't have a draft. We don't have people that are participating in the collective defense of the nation. Do you feel like the world we're heading into is becoming increasingly less compatible with the traditional notions of a citizen democracy and a republic and a citizen armed forces defense that this country was built out of?
No, I don't go that far, but I see where you're coming from.
I'm having a hard time articulating it.
No. No. You got two things going in there. One is, to me, when you endanger or damage American life and property, that's an attack on our country. And as Secretary of Defense, it's my job to protect you against that. And so I know how to call it the way I see it. And even in these gray areas, we're going to have to call it and say in advance, look, if I see such and such a thing, given your track record, you can change your track record, you say to another country, so that I will perceive you as not doing this kind of thing. But as long as you've established a record yourself of doing this kind of thing, I'm going to have to hold you responsible for it. And you need to do a little bit of imposition of clarity where the enemy is trying to sow a lack of clarity.
So another place where this is becoming increasingly fuzzy are autonomous weapons or drones, right? The way that we conduct strikes or war is changing, right?
Oh,
or the
absolutely.
military.
Absolutely. Going to change a lot more in
right,
coming decades.
The Defense Department.
You bet.
So as I understand it, I believe this was reported in The Guardian, but maybe it wasn't The Guardian, but I read it somewhere that the Trump administration already in 2 years has killed more people in drone strikes in Yemen than the Obama administration did in all of the 8 years. You don't need to comment on that. I don't know if it's accurate, but
It sounds implausible to me.
Okay, interesting. It might have been civilians killed in action then. Enemies killed in action.
I would hesitate to levy that criticism against the new administration. I just know the system very well. I know our military very well. We don't conduct airstrikes that way. We do follow the rule of law, our own law, international law. Our rules of engagement usually are not what drives the effectiveness of our strikes. It's lack of intelligence, lack of progress on the battlefield. This idea that we've shackled ourselves, and if we just loosened up the rules, things would get a lot easier, is not really empirically correct. So for that reason, and because I have a little more trust in our institutions, I doubt that statistic. I'd be surprised.
Okay, so then let's actually scale it back to the Obama administration. And this brings us back to the point about Obama coming into office with 2 wars, with Afghanistan and Iraq, and the public wanting to scale back those wars, to end those wars. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that Barack Obama relied on more than his predecessor was drone strikes.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I assume that was because he was trying to address the exigencies or the existential threats against the country or against its foreign interests without having to deploy a large ground force, a turn of strategic thinking?
I think it was a turn of strategic affairs. The drone had come of age. Anybody who was president in this time, if you were going to put up an aircraft to conduct a strike, and you could have a person in it or not have a person in it, and if you have a person in it, like we had in Kosovo, remember the now Chief of Staff of the Air Force was shot down in Kosovo. And it was a very uncomfortable big deal for us because you had one of our pilots potentially falling into enemy hands. It would be a propaganda bonanza. They might parade them around. They might do what they did to that Jordanian pilot when ISIS. And believe me, I talk to air crews all the time, and what was uppermost on their mind is the idea that they would get downed and we wouldn't get them before they got out. So if you're going to do one of these strikes and you don't need a person, why would you ever use
that? Makes sense. No, so actually, let me restate it. It isn't the actual use of drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. It is the deployment of these systems in areas where we're not officially at war. And they're used to kill people that we identify as terrorists. So, in other words, many people, myself included, assume that people like yourself and other people in government are operating with good intentions. You know, for example, when James,
hope people assume that.
Well, I do, and I think a lot of people do. There is, of course, lazy thinking, and passions ignite. And when you're younger, perhaps you see things more in black and white. But as you get older and you experience and you meet people, you understand that most people are actually trying to do the right thing. I think that's actually, in some sense, exemplified in James Clapper's testimony to Congress, where they asked him about mass surveillance. I think James Clapper's answer to that question stemmed from good nature. I think that people that work in the intelligence community are, by and large, good people attempting to do good work.
Certainly my
but
experience.
It brings us back to the dilemma. This dilemma, which is we have a Bill of Rights, we have the Constitution, we have the individual, and then we have the exigencies, the existential threats. Does this concern you? You've talked a little bit about AI. I don't know how familiar you are with thinking about value loading and utility functions.
Yeah, sure.
Well, this is concerning because we have a world where we have these types of weapons. We have systems that are being increasingly deployed outside of the traditional battlefield. And there is a tremendous amount of power being vested at the top of these pyramids, power pyramids. And now we're beginning to introduce increasingly intelligent machines, and we're going to be loading them with our values, and these are the values. So does that concern you? Because right now, I'll say one more thing, because for you, I'll just say this. You were defense secretary, and even if you're not defense secretary, you talked about this before, you were head of the DOD, you were friends with Bob Gates, you know all these people, there's a different sense for you of your proximity to solution.
Yeah.
That's not the case for us, right?
Sure.
But this, I think, brings this problem to the forefront for you as well, because you're also not a machine. So does this future concern you?
Well, it does, but only if we fail to do something, which is what I think the principal danger of technology ends up being, which is technology, in my judgment, doesn't change. Very few technologies change the fundamental human dilemmas. What happens, Demetri, is people have trouble finding their old values and their old dilemmas in the new technology. So right now, when it comes to AI, we're trying to find human accountability and responsibility. When it comes to social media, we're trying to find freedom of speech and truth at the same time. And it's not that freedom of speech and truth are outdated. It's that the technology has changed. And if we work hard enough, I believe we'll find those values have been around since Plato or something, and I happen to believe in them. And as a technologist, I find
Which
it
values
easier.
do you mean?
Well, the truth is worth following, worth identifying and following, that freedom is a good thing. And people will say to me, well, now that the drone exists, does that mean that the rules of warfare are off? And I say, no, if you don't think about the rules of warfare, but you think about what they're based on, which is some common sense and some values, you can find that in the new technology. It just takes a little bit of work. Now, it's easier for me because I'm a technologist. And so it's easier for me to find the old values and get a little more squared away and situated when a new circumstance comes along. I grant that, than somebody who isn't as technically grounded as I am. But that ought to be the objective. But I think some people are ready to throw away all of the political baby with the new political wardrobe of technology bathwater. Are you following what I'm?
I think so.
Yeah,
I mean, I
sorry,
don't know that I'm following.
The metaphor.
I'm not sure that I'm following my own thoughts.
Metaphor wasn't
I think
wonderful.
I have some
but
sense
you
what
know,
you're saying.
these are old dilemmas in a new form, and the new form created by the new technology. But they are the old dilemmas. So let's go back to what we thought we knew before there was the internet. There was the telephone. What did we think we knew about surveillance? We knew that occasionally the government would be listening in on a conversation between an American and, let us say, a non-American. And we wrote rules that said this will happen, but when it happens, here's how you're to behave in such a way that you don't endanger the freedom of individual Americans. And those rules actually worked for quite a long time. I saw them work during all the era of telephone communications when I was cleared for that kind of material. Now, why can't you do that in the internet? It's a larger volume of stuff and so forth, but the same rule applies. The government is not to use information collected for the citizen's benefit against the citizen as an individual. That's the rule. Mm-hmm. Why can't we do that with electronic data? There's no reason why we can't do that electronic data if we could do that with a telephone conversation or rifling through somebody's apartment without a warrant.
Right.
These things are, it's the same principle. It's just in a new technological guise.
Yeah, we did an episode on this, and I'm getting the cane, so I'm going to have to let you go, Secretary Carter. As much as I'd like to keep you here.
This is a lot of fun,
I'd actually
Demetri.
like to lock the door. I'd be happy to still have you stay. It's up to you. You're the boss.
I get a real kick out of it. You've obviously done a lot of thinking about
It's not easy.
things.
This isn't, I'm trying to navigate this conversation as best as I can. So I will, again, I'm getting the cane here. But we did an episode on this for listeners on, I think it was Jeffrey Rosen, the president of the National Constitution Center, where we covered the history of constitutional law in line with changing technologies. I think the nature of metadata and big data and the type of information you can extract at a very high level with these data sets today changes this?
I do think we need, if I can just say a closing note on that kind of bridges that subject of me being Secretary of Defense. When I left the Pentagon, I wanted to write this book that I've now finished about my time at the Pentagon, but that era is now behind me. I got to the top. I don't have anywhere else to go in defense. And so now you say, well, Ash, what are you going to do now? And I could just do nothing.
You're going to tell us you're going to run for president?
No.
That'd be great. I'm looking for a news
join the dozens of people who are doing that? No. What I was going to say was that I said to myself, what is the next, other than defending ourselves, the next big challenge? And to me, it is tech and public purpose and finding what is good for the public within the new technological world, whether it be the digital world or the biotech revolution that is coming, or the whole question of jobs and unemployment and training and getting phased out and not having a future for yourself. These are very big dilemmas that are posed by technology, and I think they, next to national defense, which always come first because you can't do anything if you don't have security, but next to that is the biggest challenge to our society, and that's kind of what I'm devoting myself to now. So I'm very much the subject of this conversation, but trying to find real practical solutions. So what do we do about AI? What do we do about social media? What do we do about genome editing? We got to do something about these things.
Yeah.
We can't sit and dither and get worried about them. We need to find a reasonable solution to them. I'm confident that there are reasonable solutions.
For relatively new listeners or people that are new to the podcast, we did an episode on the innovation economy. In fact, it wasn't just that. We did a number of episodes talking about Vannevar Bush, Claude Shannon, the role of Bell Labs, the misconceptions. This brings us back to this thing about being self-made. There are a lot of misconceptions about how the private sector monetized many of the technologies and protocols developed out of government research. There's a lot of positive that came out of that relationship. Again, this is why nuance is important in these conversations. I also want to say, before we end, Secretary Carter, we normally record overtime segments with our guests, but given the limited amount of time we had for this recording, the overtime instead will be a pre-release of my hour-long conversation with Professor of International Relations Stephen Walt, which I am recording tomorrow on American foreign policy and the future of U.S. primacy, which listeners can access along with a transcript of this week's episode and a copy of my entire 12-page rundown full of notes and links to source material from today's conversation by supporting the podcast through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Thank you so much for coming on the program,
Thanks for
Secretary
having
Carter.
me, Demetri.
And that was my episode with U.S. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. I want to thank Dr. Carter for being on my program. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded at Creative Media Design Studio in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.